The title of the Gosho is Letter from Teradomari. Let's first listen to the background of this Gosho. After his unsuccessful attempt to execute Nichiren Daishonin at Tatsunokuchi on the 12th day of the 9th month, 1271, Hei no Saemon, Deputy Chief of the Office of Military and Police Affairs, had no choice other than to follow the government's original instructions to deliver the Daishonin into the custody of Homma Rokurō Saemon Shigetsura, the Deputy Constable of Sado. The Daishonin was confined for nearly a month at Homma's residence in Echi, Sagami Province, awaiting word of his fate from the government. On the 10th day of the 10th month, Nichiren Daishonin left Echi, escorted by Homma's warriors. When the group reached the coast of the Sea of Japan on the 21st, snow covered the ground and the sea was very rough. They were forced to stop for several days at a harbor called Teradomari in Echigo and wait for the winds to abate before crossing to Sado Island. Teradomari is said to have prospered from the early 9th century on as a port for shipping traffic between the island of Sado and the Japanese mainland. The day after arriving at Teradomari, the Daishonin wrote this letter and entrusted it to a lay priest whom Toki Jōnin had sent to accompany him. The community of believers in Kamakura had been badly shaken by the events of the Tatsunokuchi persecution and the Sado exile, and many among the Daishonin's disciples and lay supporters succumbed to government pressures and gave up their faith, or began to have doubts when they saw the Daishonin persecuted. In order to help his followers dispel their doubts and persevere in faith, the Daishonin during his exile produced a number of writings. This letter is the first of these writings, which include the opening of the eyes, letter from Sado, and on practicing the Buddha's teachings. At the beginning of this letter, the Daishonin mentions in passing the hardships and difficulties he experienced during the 12-day journey to Teradomari. He then quotes scriptural passages to show that, in the latter day of the law, hatred and jealousy of the Lotus Sutra will be worse than during the Buddha's lifetime. He himself is actually confronting such opposition, he says. Next, citing TNTAI's view of the Nirvana Sutra as precious jewels to redeem the life of the Lotus, the Daishonin declares the superiority of the Lotus over all other sutras and points out the mistaken views of the scholars of the various schools who fail to recognize this. In particular, he mentions the erroneous opinions of the True Word school deriving from Shan Wuwei and others. He warns that the followers of the various schools are committing the offense of slandering the Lotus Sutra, unaware that their patriarchs inwardly concurred with the teachings of the TNTAI school, which are based on the Lotus Sutra. The Daishonin next enumerates 4 frequent criticisms of his method of propagation, raised not only by his enemies but by some of his own followers as well, and declares that the hardships he has encountered perfectly match the prophecies of the Encouraging Devotion chapter of the Lotus Sutra. In light of the sutra, he makes clear that he himself is the votary who propagates the sutra in the latter day of the law. Now listen to the Gosho. I have received the string of coins that you sent. Those resolved to seek the way should gather and listen to the contents of this letter. This month, the 10th month, on the 10th day, we left the village of Echi in Eiko district of the province of Sagami. Along the way we stopped at Kamegawa in the province of Musashi and, after traveling for 12 days, arrived here at the harbor of Teradomari in the province of Echigo. From here we are going to cross the sea to the island province of Sado, but at the moment the winds are not favorable, so I do not know when we will depart. The hardships along the way were worse than I could have imagined, and indeed more than I can put down in writing. I will leave you to surmise what I endured. But I have been prepared for such difficulties from the outset, so there is no point in starting to complain about them now. I shall accordingly say no more of the matter. The 4th volume of the Lotus Sutra states, since hatred and jealousy toward this sutra abound even when the Thus Come One is in the world, how much more will this be so after his passing? The 5th volume says, it will face much hostility in the world and be difficult to believe. And the 38th volume of the Nirvana Sutra states, at that time all the non-Buddhists spoke, to King Ajatashatru, saying, O great king, at present there is a man of incomparable wickedness, a monk called Gautama. All sorts of evil people, hoping to gain profit and alms, have flocked to him and become his followers. These people do not practice goodness, but instead use the power of spells and magic to win over men like Mahakashyapa, Shariputra, and Maudgalyana. This passage from the Nirvana Sutra recounts the evil words that the various non-Buddhists spoke against Shakyamuni Buddha because he refuted the scriptures preached by their original teachers, the two deities and the three ascetics. In the above passages from the Lotus Sutra, however, it is not the Buddha himself who is being looked upon as an enemy. Rather, as TNTAI explains, it is the Lotus Sutra that is being opposed by the various voice-hearers and cause-awakened ones and the bodhisattvas who seek only the Buddha of recent enlightenment. In other words, persons who show no desire to hear or believe in the Lotus Sutra or who say that it does not match their capacity, though they may not actually slander it in so many words, are all to be regarded as persons of hatred and jealousy. Observing the situation when the Buddha was in the world and comparing it with the situation since his passing, we may say that the scholars of the various schools in the world today are like the non-Buddhists of the Buddha's time. They too speak of a man of incomparable wickedness, by which they mean me, Nichiren. They speak of all sorts of evil people who have flocked to him, by which they mean my disciples and followers. The non-Buddhists, having incorrectly received and transmitted the teachings of the earlier Buddhas, displayed hostility toward the later Buddha, Shakyamuni. The scholars of the various schools today are just the same. In effect, they have let their own way of understanding the Buddha's teachings lead them into erroneous views. They are like persons who, dizzy from drink, think that the huge mountain in front of them is spinning round and round. And so we now have these 8 schools or 10 schools all disputing with one another over their various doctrines. The 18th volume of the Nirvana Sutra sets forth the doctrine of the precious jewels that redeem life. The great teacher TNTAI, after studying and pondering this passage, concluded that life refers to the Lotus Sutra, and the precious jewels to the first 3 of the 4 teachings expounded in the Nirvana Sutra. But what then of the 4th or perfect teaching, which the Nirvana Sutra also expounds? This teaching represents a reiteration of the doctrine already expounded in the Lotus Sutra concerning the eternally inherent Buddha nature, and was preached to lead people to the Lotus Sutra from which it originated. The Nirvana Sutra's perfect teaching of the eternally inherent Buddha nature in fact belongs to the Lotus Sutra. The merits unique to the Nirvana Sutra are consequently limited to the first 3 of the 4 teachings. The 3rd volume of TNTAI's profound meaning of the Lotus Sutra states, the Nirvana Sutra offers precious jewels to redeem the life of the Lotus Sutra, and thus the hands are clapped and the bargain concluded. The 3rd volume of the annotations on the profound meaning of the Lotus Sutra explains this by saying, the TNTAI school cites this metaphor to indicate that the contents of the Nirvana Sutra are to be regarded as precious jewels. The great teacher TNTAI, in his work entitled The 4 Meditations, cites the passage in the Lotus Sutra that reads, though they, the Buddhas, point out various different paths, and declares that the 4 flavors of teachings are also to be regarded as precious jewels. If so, then the sutras that were preached before and after the Lotus Sutra are all to be regarded as precious jewels offered for the sake of the Lotus Sutra. But the Buddhist scholars in the world today are of the opinion that this interpretation represents a doctrine put forward by the TNTAI school alone, and that none of the other schools accepts it. When I consider the matter, however, I have this to say. The 8 or 10 schools we are speaking of all came into existence after the passing of the Buddha and are the creation of the various scholars and teachers of the time. But we should not evaluate the sutras that the Buddha preached during his lifetime on the basis of the doctrines of schools established after his passing. The judgments put forward by TNTAI, however, completely accord with the teachings of all the sutras. It is wrong to discard them on the grounds that they represent no more than the opinions of a single school. The scholars of the various schools continue to cling to the mistaken opinions of their respective teachers. Therefore, They declare that Buddhist practices must be accommodated to the people's capacities, or they defer to the opinions of their founders or try to persuade the worthy rulers of the time to be their allies. The upshot of all this is that in the end they give themselves up wholly to evil intentions, engage in wrangling and doctrinal disputes, and take delight in inflicting injury upon people who are guilty of no fault. Among the various schools, the opinions of the True Word School are particularly distorted. Its founders, Shanwuwei and Chinkongqi, maintained, the concept of 3,000 realms in a single moment of life is the most important of all TNTAI's principles and the heart and core of the teachings put forward by the Buddha in the course of his lifetime. But setting aside this doctrine that the 3,000 realms are encompassed by the mind, which constitutes the foundation of both the exoteric and the esoteric teachings, the mudras and mantras form the most crucial part of the Buddhist teachings. The teachers of the True Word School in later times have used this pronouncement as a pretext to declare that all sutras that do not mention mudras and mantras are to be regarded as inferior and, in fact, as no different from non-Buddhist teachings. Some of the esoteric teachers assert that the Mahavairakana Sutra was preached by the Thus Come One Mahavairakana, a Buddha other than the Thus Come One Shakyamuni. Others declare that it is the highest of all the teachings put forth by the Lord of Teachings, Shakyamuni Buddha, while still others say that the same Buddha manifested himself once in the form of Shakyamuni Buddha to preach the exoteric sutras, and on another occasion, in the form of the Thus Come One Mahavairakana to preach the esoteric sutras. Thus, misunderstanding the underlying principles of Buddhism, they produce an endless array of erroneous opinions. They are like a group of people who, unaware of the true color of milk, venture various speculations as to what the color might be, though none are able to surmise it correctly. Or they are like the blind men in the parable who try to guess the true shape of the elephant. In this connection, the scholars of the various schools should understand that the Mahavairakana Sutra, if preached before the Lotus Sutra, is on a level with the Flower Garland Sutra, and if preached after the Lotus Sutra, is on a level with the Nirvana Sutra. Is it not possible that the Lotus Sutra in India contained descriptions of mudras and mantras, but that those who translated the text into Chinese omitted those sections, Komarajiva calling his version the Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law? And is it also not possible that Shanwuwei added mudras and mantras and called his version the Mahavairakana Sutra? For example, there were other versions of the Lotus Sutra, such as the Lotus Sutra of the Correct Law, the supplemented Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law, the Lotus Meditation Sutra, and the Sadharmapundarika Sutra. In India after the Buddha's passing, Bodhisattva Nagarjuna was the one who truly understood the relationship between the Lotus Sutra and the other sutras, while in China the great teacher Tiantai Chi-che was the first to grasp it correctly. Men like Shanwuwei of the True Word School, Xie Qingquan of the Flower Garland School, Chia Xiang of the Three Treatises School, and Tzun of the Dharma Characteristics School each publicly upheld the doctrines of the school they had established, but in their hearts they were all won over to the teachings of the TNTAI school. Yet their disciples were ignorant of this fact and hence developed erroneous opinions. How can they avoid being guilty of slandering the correct teaching? Some people criticize me, saying, Nichiren does not understand the capacities of the people of the time, but goes around preaching in a harsh manner, that is why he meets with difficulties. Other people say, the practices described in the Encouraging Devotion, Chapter 11 are for bodhisattvas who are far advanced in practice. Nichiren ought to follow the practices of the Peaceful Practices chapter, yet he fails to do so. Others say, I, too, know the Lotus Sutra is supreme, but I say nothing about it. Still others complain that I give all my attention to doctrinal teachings. I am well aware of all these criticisms against me. But I recall the case of Pian Ho, who had his legs cut off at the knee, and of Kayamaro, pure man, who was dubbed Kidanamaro, filthy man, and almost put to death. All the people of the time laughed at them with scorn, but unlike those two men, those who laughed left no good name behind them. And all the people who level unjust criticisms at me will meet with a similar fate. The Encouraging Devotion chapter says, there will be many ignorant people who will curse and speak ill of us. I observe my own situation in this passage. Why should it not apply to all of you as well? They will attack us with swords and staves, the passage continues. I have experienced this passage from the sutra with my own body. Why do you, my disciples, not do likewise? Further on, the passage says, in the midst of the great assembly they constantly try to defame us, and they will address the rulers, high ministers, Brahmins, and householders, slandering and speaking evil of us. And they will confront us with foul language and angry frowns. Again and again we will be banished. Again and again means time after time. And I, Nichiren, have been repeatedly driven away, and have twice been condemned to exile. The Lotus Sutra accords with the fashion of the preaching employed by all Buddhas of the three existences. The past events described in the Never Disparaging chapter 1 am now experiencing as predicted in the Encouraging Devotion chapter. Thus the present foretold in the Encouraging Devotion chapter corresponds to the past of the Never Disparaging chapter. The Encouraging Devotion chapter of the present will be the Never Disparaging chapter of the future, and at that time, I, Nichiren, will be its Bodhisattva Never Disparaging. The Lotus Sutra consists of a single work in 8 volumes and 28 chapters, but I have heard that the sutra as it existed in India was long enough to stretch over a whole yojana. In other words, there must have been many more chapters to it. The 28-chapter version used today in China and Japan represents the most essential portion of an abbreviated version. Let us set aside for now the revelation section of the sutra. In the following transmission section, the 3 pronouncements of the Treasure Tower chapter are delivered to the assembly gathered at Eagle Peak and present at the ceremony in the air. As to the vow made in the Encouraging Devotion chapter by the 20,000, 80,000, and 800,000 million Nayotas of great Bodhisattvas, a man of shallow wisdom like myself cannot comprehend it. But the phrase, in an age of fear and evil, that appears in this chapter nevertheless indicates the beginning of the latter day of the law. The following, Peaceful Practices, chapter refers to this age of fear and evil, with the words, in the latter age. And looking at other translations of the sutra, we find that in the Lotus Sutra of the correct law it appears as, in the latter age hereafter, or, in the latter age to come, while in the supplemented Lotus Sutra of the Wonderful Law it appears as, in an age of fear and evil. In this latter age, which corresponds to our own time, the 3 types of enemies have appeared, but not a single one of the 800,000 million Nayotas of Bodhisattvas is anywhere to be seen. It is like a lake that has dried and is missing its full share of water, or a waning moon that is far from full. If the water is clear, it will reflect the moon's image, and if trees are planted, then birds can nest in them. Therefore, I, Nichiren, propagate this sutra in place of the 800,000 million Nayotas of Bodhisattvas. I ask that those Bodhisattvas grant me their aid and protection. The lay priest who bears this letter tells me that you instructed him to accompany me to the province of Sado. But in view of the expenses of the trip and other difficulties, I am sending him back to you. I already know the depths of your consideration. Please explain to the others what I have written here. I am very much concerned about the priests who are in prison, and I hope you will inform me of their situation at your earliest convenience. Respectfully, Nichiren. The hour of the cock, 5 to 7 p.m., the 22nd day of the 10th month, to Toki